Welcome, my dear literature enthusiasts. It feels good to have you here again, ready to dive into the strange, layered, and unsettling spaces where film collides with philosophy. Tonight, I want to invite you into a discussion of Fight Club, 1999, a film that's been argued about, quoted endlessly, misunderstood, and canonized all at once. Before we begin, let me gently ask, if you enjoy these kinds of explorations where cinema is treated less like spectacle and more like text, please like this video and subscribe. It's not just a button. It's the way our little circle stays alive, a community that values depth over speed, ideas over noise. And to be clear, this is not a review in the conventional sense. I'm not here to tell you whether this film is good or bad. I'm here to walk with you through its shadows, its contradictions, its literary bones. This is a theoretical and critical analysis meant for those who read films the way others read novels, lingering in metaphors, savoring paradoxes. When I first encountered this story, I was much younger, caught in that restless stage of life where the world's promises seemed strangely hollow. It struck me in ways I couldn't articulate then. I didn't have the vocabulary of Freud or Marx or Nietzsche at my fingertips, but I felt the hunger in it. The gnawing dissatisfaction with a life measured in catalogs and furniture, the aching desire to feel something real even if it meant bleeding for it. Watching it again years later, with more experience, more disillusionment, and more perspective, I find myself just as unsettled but for different reasons. It doesn't shock me with its violence the way it once did. Instead, it unsettles me with its insights, its questions about how we build identity when society seems designed to sell us every version except our own. The story begins in the quiet monotony of a man whose life is defined by absence. He lives but barely. His existence is cataloged by office supplies, his sleep stolen by insomnia, his identity dissolving into the hum of fluorescent lights and corporate mantras. There's something profoundly literary in these opening strokes, the kind of existential grayness you'd find in Camus or Kafka. He attends support groups, not because he belongs there, but because the rawness of suffering in those rooms gives him something he can't find anywhere else. The permission to feel, to cry, to exist authentically for a few stolen minutes. It's perverse, yes, but it's also painfully human. How many of us have gravitated towards spaces we didn't quite belong to, simply because they gave us a glimpse of something real? The arrival of another figure into this wasteland of a life shifts everything. At first, he's simply a man encountered on a plane, charming and strange, the kind of person who radiates an unsettling freedom. But soon, he becomes more, a companion, a guide, a mirror reflecting back the narrator's suppressed desires. The story escalates quickly from conversation to action, from theory to practice. Fists collide in the quiet dark of a parking lot, and what begins as an odd ritual of two men quickly spreads like wildfire, a secret congregation of bodies seeking meaning in pain. The first time I saw those fights, I was disturbed. The violence is ugly, unpolished, not choreographed like action cinema usually is. And yet, the ugliness felt deliberate. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about feeling, about shaking loose the numbness of a life anesthetized by consumerism. As someone who's wrestled with my own cycles of apathy and restless longing, I couldn't dismiss it as simple brutality. I saw in it an allegory, a desperate attempt to reassert humanity through intensity, even if that intensity meant destruction. The film builds itself like a spiral, tightening with each turn. What starts as a rebellion against monotony evolves into an underground movement with rules, rituals, hierarchies. What once felt liberating becomes controlling. What once was personal becomes political. The escalation is terrifying in its inevitability. You can sense from early on that this won't end in catharsis, but in chaos. And yet, watching it, you're pulled along, complicit in the fascination. That's part of its genius. It seduces even as it warrants. Key elements rise to the surface, shimmering with symbolic weight. Soap, for instance, becomes both a mundane commodity and a metaphor for transformation, for destruction repurposed into creation. The basements where fights erupt feel like caverns of ritual, modern-day temples where men confess through bruises instead of words. The insomnia that haunts the narrator serves not only as a medical condition, but as a metaphor for alienation, wakefulness without awareness, life lived without truly being awake. And then there are the twists, carefully seeded long before they detonate. The second half reveals what the first half has been hiding, recontextualizing every glance, every conversation, every decision. I won't spell it out bluntly here, but the shock of it is not in the revelation itself. It's in what it means. It tells us that the very rebellion we've been watching was never entirely real, that the freedom being celebrated was an illusion born of desperation. For me, that twist resonates beyond the plot. It speaks to how often our rebellions, our escapes, our new selves are still constructed from the same broken pieces of the old system. We think we've broken free, but often we're still imprisoned, just in different clothing. What lingers long after the credits roll is not the violence, not the destruction, but the questions. What does it mean to be awake in a world designed to lull us into comfortable sleep? What does it mean to build identity when consumerism sells us versions of ourselves prepackaged? What happens when rebellion itself becomes dogma, when freedom calcifies into tyranny? These are not questions with easy answers, and that's why the film endures, not because it tells us how to live, but because it confronts us with how we are already living. Personally, I've carried it with me like a troublesome friend, one I don't always agree with, one I sometimes resent, but one I can't stop thinking about. There are moments in my own life where I've looked around at the routines, the purchases, the quiet scripts of existence, and felt that gnawing emptiness. And while I would never seek meaning in the brutal rituals depicted, I understand the hunger behind them. The desire to break something, anything, just to prove you're alive. That's why this story resonates so deeply with me. Not because I admire its characters, but because I recognize their despair. And that's where I'll leave you for now, on the edge of those questions. We've introduced the world, traced its spiral from monotony into chaos, and teased the revelations that shift everything you thought you understood. Ahead lies deeper analysis of character, of theme, of the strange alchemy that turns soap and bruises into philosophy. But for now, sit with this. The story is not about fights, not about clubs, but about us, our longings, our rebellions, our illusions, and the uncomfortable truths we often prefer not to face. It begins not with thunder, but with quiet disarray, the kind of disarray that creeps into your bones when the life you're living feels both suffocatingly full and achingly empty at the same time. A man sits awake in the middle of the night, the glow of the television his only companion, flipping through late-night commercials that sell him everything he never asked for. He has a job, an apartment filled with carefully chosen furniture, an endless catalog of things that are supposed to define him. Yet what defines him more is absence. Absence of sleep, absence of connection, absence of meaning. Insomnia turns every day into a blur, a waking dream where nothing feels real, where everything has the texture of plastic. Watching him, I always think of those moments in my own life where I've stared at ceilings at 3 a.m., aware that the hours are slipping away, but powerless to surrender to rest. That strange awareness, that twilight between waking and sleeping, is the atmosphere of his entire life. Desperation drives him into odd corners. He stumbles upon support groups meant for the terminally ill, for those fighting addictions, for those whose lives are measured in weeks and not years. At first, it feels grotesque, even cruel, an imposter feeding on the sorrow of others. But what makes it strangely poignant is that he isn't there for amusement. He's there because in those rooms, surrounded by people willing to collapse into each other's arms, he finally feels release. He can cry. He can let go. He can be something other than the hollow mask he wears in daylight. His insomnia, miraculously, eases after those nights. I remember the first time I saw that, thinking how human it was in its brokenness, how sometimes we steal authenticity wherever we can find it, even if it doesn't belong to us. He's not mocking their pain. He's borrowing their truth to survive his own numbness. But then she arrives, Marla. The intrusion of another fraud into his fragile ritual destabilizes everything. She's chaotic where he is repressed, unashamed where he is furtive. She attends the same support groups, claiming spaces not hers, disrupting his stolen authenticity. Her presence enrages him, not because she's different, but because she is exactly the same. She mirrors his fraudulence, forcing him to confront the lie he's been living. Their confrontations are awkward, tinged with resentment, yet beneath that resentment lies recognition. They are both imposters, both seeking something real in places they don't belong. For me, Marla has always embodied the discomfort of seeing yourself reflected in someone else. How we often hate in others what we can't bear to acknowledge in ourselves. The narrative shifts when he meets a man on a plane, someone magnetic in a way that unsettles. This figure, with his easy charm and unfiltered disdain for convention, radiates a freedom the insomniac has never known. Their conversation is sharp, filled with provocations disguised as small talk. He's the kind of person you meet once and never forget, not because of what he says, but because of what he awakens in you. I've had those encounters before. Strangers who appear at the exact moment you're most vulnerable, who seem to know what you're yearning for before you've admitted it to yourself. That's the effect here. An ignition, a spark in the dullness of a life blurred by routine. When the narrator returns home, he finds his apartment reduced to ashes. The carefully curated furniture, the objects cataloged in his memory, the identity he thought he had constructed, it's all gone. There's an eerie irony in that destruction, as if the universe itself had intervened to strip him of his illusions. Homeless in spirit and space, he remembers the man from the plane and reaches out. Their reunion is electric, as though destiny had arranged the catastrophe to bring them together. What follows is not a conversation, but a ritual, the kind of ritual that feels absurd and yet inevitable. They stand outside a bar, and instead of offering sympathy, instead of offering shelter, the new companion offers something stranger. A fight. Not anger, not hatred, just fists connecting with flesh as a form of release. The first punch is tentative, almost laughable, but soon the rhythm takes hold. They fight until bodies ache and laughter erupts, until the pain becomes proof that they are alive. That night, something is born, not a friendship in the conventional sense, but a pact, an initiation into a way of being that rejects the numbness of their previous lives. Their strange ritual grows. They find themselves repeating it, seeking out dark corners where fists can fly without consequence. Others notice, others join, and soon what was two becomes many. In basements beneath bars, groups of men gather to feel something beyond the routines that smother them. The rules are simple, almost primal, and in those underground spaces, a community forms, not around conversation or ideology, but around shared bruises, shared catharsis. It's disturbing, yes, but also strangely moving. Watching those scenes, I couldn't help but think of how desperate people are for belonging, how often we build communities not around what uplifts us, but around what allows us to feel less alone in our despair. The narrator, once passive and hollow, begins to change. His body carries marks, his confidence grows, his disdain for his old life sharpens. The office that once imprisoned him now seems absurd, its routines ridiculous in the face of what he has discovered. He begins to disrupt, to mock, to test boundaries. The more he fights at night, the less he cares about the facade of day. I think of how intoxicating it can feel to shed the weight of roles, even temporarily, and how easily that intoxication can curdle into destruction. Meanwhile, Marla re-enters the story, a constant reminder of his unresolved self. Her chaos bleeds into his newfound identity, her presence both irritating and magnetic. She and his companion strike up their own strange connection, one that unsettles him deeply. It's not jealousy in the traditional sense. It's something stranger, a feeling that his fragile sense of reality is slipping further from his grasp. The spiral tightens. What began as cathartic brawls becomes organized, ritualized. The basement gathering spread, rules etched into memory, numbers swelling. The narrator is swept along by momentum he never intended. Watching as the thing he helped create takes on a life of its own. What fascinates me about this progression is how it mirrors so many movements in history. What starts as rebellion, raw and personal, often evolves in a structure, hierarchy, ideology. Freedom calcifies into discipline, spontaneity into order. The irony is that the fight against control becomes its own kind of control. By this point, the narrator is no longer simply a man lost in insomnia. He is entangled in something larger than himself, something he doesn't fully understand. His life has shifted entirely, his possessions gone, his routines abandoned, his identity rewritten in bruises and rituals. Yet beneath the transformation lies a growing unease, a sense that what he's built may not be liberation, but another prison. Watching this part of the story unfold, I always feel the tension between exhilaration and dread, as though I'm witnessing a train gathering speed on tracks that inevitably bend toward disaster. And this is where the first half leaves us, in a thick of transformation, intoxicated by the discovery of something raw and real, yet haunted by the sense that beneath the surface, something is terribly wrong. The rules have been set, the community has grown, the narrator has changed. But the seeds of chaos, of revelation, of collapse, are already planted. We don't yet know the full shape of what's coming, but we can feel its shadow. The story hums with the anticipation of truths too disruptive to stay hidden, of identities too fractured to hold together. And as the basement fills with voices chanting rules, fists colliding in the dark, the audience is left both exhilarated and unsettled, wondering just how far this spiral will twist before it breaks. What unfolds next feels like slipping deeper into a dream, the kind of dream where you're aware enough to know something isn't right, but powerless to wake yourself. The underground gatherings, once small and secretive, begin to swell. They spread across cities, whispered about, replicated, expanding far beyond the control of the man who first stumbled into this strange ritual. The rules he thought were mere words in a smoky basement are now commandments followed with religious fervor. What was once personal catharsis has grown into something sprawling, something unrecognizable, something dangerous. Watching this progression, I always feel the uneasy recognition of how quickly rebellion can calcify into dogma, how liberation can turn into its own machinery of control. The narrator finds himself both enthralled and disturbed. He wanted release, not revolution. Yet everywhere he looks, faces turn to him with reverence he never asked for. Men salute him, obey him, speak of him as though he were prophet rather than participant. There's a chilling irony in this. The quest to dismantle systems of power has birthed a new system, one more zealous and unquestioning than the old. The basements have transformed into training grounds, the bruises into badges of belonging, the rituals into liturgy. I couldn't help but think of history's revolutions, where the moment of freedom births its own tyranny. Here, it plays out not in parliaments or palaces, but in cellars and shadows. Marla drifts in and out, her presence always a disruption. She is both anchor and irritant, a reminder of a world outside the rituals of fists and commands. Her chaos cuts through the illusion, and he cannot bear it. Every encounter with her seems to unravel him further. She isn't just a person in his orbit. She's a mirror he doesn't want to face, proof that his carefully constructed reality is cracking. When she speaks too directly, too honestly, forcing him to hear truths he'd rather bury. It's no wonder that his relationship with her feels like both lifeline and threat. The spiral tightens further when the companion who once felt like freedom incarnate begins to show another face. He isn't just a charming provocateur anymore. He is leader, commander, architect of a movement growing beyond control. He speaks of revolution, of tearing down the structures of modern life, of reshaping society itself. What was once banter over beers becomes manifestos delivered to crowds. The narrator, increasingly alienated, begins to question, whose vision is this? Whose rebellion are they living? It's no longer about feeling alive in the sting of a punch. It's about obliteration, about chaos for its own sake. The violence escalates. What began with fists in basements spreads into the streets, into acts of vandalism and sabotage. Project Mayhem, as it comes to be called, is no longer a secret society, but a network of zealots. Their uniform is anonymity, their creed obedience, their purpose destruction. The narrator watches in horror as individuality disappears, replaced by faceless commitment to a cause he doesn't fully understand. He tries to resist, to assert some measure of control, but it's too late. The machine has outgrown its creator. Then comes the fracture, the twist that redefines everything we thought we knew. In a series of revelations, the narrator discovers that the man who has guided him, who has drawn him into this spiral, is not separate from him at all. They are one and the same, two halves of a fractured psyche. The charming provocateur is his projection, his alter ego, the embodiment of everything he wished to be but could not admit. Every conversation, every plan, every fight was a dialogue with himself, a battle between repression and desire, conformity and chaos. The realization crashes over him like ice water. For me, this moment has always been less about shock than about recognition. The recognition that so often the voices that guide us, inspire us, or terrify us are echoes of our own suppressed selves. This revelation recontextualizes everything. The fights were him hitting himself, the plans his own, the chaos his creation. Project Mayhem is not a movement led by someone else. It is his shadow made flesh, his suppressed rage institutionalized. It's chilling, not because of the mechanics of the twist, but because of what it says. The enemy was never outside. The enemy was always within. Every time I watch this unfold, I think about the ways we externalize our inner conflicts, blaming society, corporations, governments, when sometimes the most destructive wars are the ones raging in our own minds. The discovery doesn't stop the movement, it accelerates it. The companion, now revealed as his alter, becomes more dominant, more insistent. He is no longer just a figment. He is a rival, a tyrant, a part of himself too powerful to ignore. The narrator tries to resist, to shut it down, but everywhere he turns, men salute him, call him by the alter's name, obey orders he doesn't remember giving. It's a nightmare of dissociation, to be held accountable for actions you don't recall, to be feared and revered for words you never spoke aloud. Marlowe returns once more, the thread of reality he clings to. He tries to explain, to confess, but how does one confess that the chaos consuming the world is one's own shadow? She doesn't fully understand. How could she? But her presence forces him to keep grasping at his humanity. She is not savior, not muse, but witness. And sometimes that is the most powerful role, to be the one who sees, who refuses to let the spiral be dismissed as mere illusion. The climax builds with inevitability. Project Mayhem's plans reach their apex. The coordinated destruction of financial records, a symbolic act meant to erase debt, to collapse systems of power. Its revolution rendered as spectacle, violence disguised as liberation. The narrator, desperate to stop it, battles his alter self in a war that plays out both within and without. Gun in hand, he confronts not an external villain, but himself, the embodiment of his own darkest desires. The struggle is visceral, absurd, terrifying, because it isn't just a battle of bodies. It's a battle for ownership of identity. In the end, he finds the only way to win is to accept the truth. He cannot outfight his alter. He can only outlive him. With a decision both desperate and profound, he turns the gun on himself. The act is both suicide and survival, a symbolic killing of the part of himself that sought annihilation. He collapses, wounded but alive, his alter finally silenced. What follows is the haunting resolution. He takes Marla's hand as the world outside crumbles, skyscrapers collapsing in perfect symmetry. Together, they stand as witnesses to both destruction and rebirth. What follows is the haunting resolution. He takes Marla's hand as the world outside crumbles, skyscrapers collapsing in perfect symmetry. Together, they stand as witnesses to both destruction and rebirth. The final image is not triumph or tragedy, but ambiguity. Two people holding hands as society's structures fall, uncertain of what comes next. For me, it's one of the most haunting images in modern cinema. Not because of the spectacle of falling buildings, but because of the intimacy of that gesture, the reminder that in the face of chaos, connection remains the only real anchor. And so the story closes, not with resolution, but with questions. Was this liberation or delusion? Was the destruction an act of freedom or just another form of control? What part of ourselves must we kill to survive? The ambiguity lingers, demanding that we wrestle with it long after the credits fade. Each time I revisit it, I find myself unsettled in new ways, reminded that the line between rebellion and self-destruction is perilously thin, and that the shadows we project outward often live within us, waiting to be confronted. Characters in this story are not just figures moving through a plot. They're archetypes, mirrors, fractured selves, and raw embodiments of ideas that haunt us all. Every time I revisit it, I find myself less concerned with what they do and more with what they signify, the way they act like prisms refracting the contradictions of modern existence. To describe them is to trace not only their arcs, but the lingering shadows they cast in our own lives. The narrator, whose name shifts and fractures with every introduction, is the quiet center of chaos. He is the man who cannot sleep, who catalogs furniture to give himself an identity, who drifts through life as though waiting for something unnamed to finally claim him. On the surface, he is ordinary, white-collar job, bland apartment, polite small talk. But beneath that ordinary exterior festers emptiness. I think of him often as the embodiment of quiet despair, the kind that isn't dramatic but numbing, the kind that seeps into daily life unnoticed until it consumes you. His insomnia is not just a medical condition. It is a metaphor for his alienation, for living without ever being truly awake. What makes him fascinating is how much of him feels familiar. I remember being younger and feeling that same gnawing sense that life was happening in prepackaged pieces, that my worth was measured by the objects I owned, the roles I played, the scripts I followed. Watching him, I recognized the fear of looking inward, the dread of admitting that what you've built isn't a self but a shell. His arc is not about finding meaning in the world, but about dismantling the illusions he clung to for survival. And in that dismantling, he becomes both tragic and terrifying. Then there is the other figure, the alter ego born of suppressed longing. He is everything the narrator believes he is not. Charismatic, fearless, irreverent, anarchic. Where the narrator is cautious, he is reckless. Where the narrator obeys, he defies. Where the narrator oppresses, he erupts. He doesn't just live outside the system. He wages war against it. And yet, what unsettles me most about him is not his rebellion, but his absolutism. He promises freedom, but offers obedience, offers authenticity, but demands surrender. He is seductive precisely because he says what we all sometimes want to hear, that the things we own don't matter, that the roles we've been given are lies, that we can burn it all down and start again. But hidden in that seduction is a trap. His freedom is not true freedom. It is another cage, another form of control disguised as liberation. The relationship between the narrator and this alter is one of the most compelling depictions of inner conflict I've ever seen. They are not opposites so much as extensions of each other, halves of a psyche split in two. Their dialogue is not really dialogue. It's the echo of suppressed desires clashing against repression. Watching them together, I always feel the weight of that paradox. The liberator who enslaves, the rebel who dictates, the fantasy self who becomes tyrant. It is, in many ways, the perfect dramatization of the Jungian shadow, the the part of us we bury, only to find it ruling us from the dark. Marla, meanwhile, is the wild card, the jagged edge of reality that keeps puncturing the dream. From the moment she appears, she destabilizes the narrator. She is as fraudulent as he is, attending support groups she doesn't belong to, mirroring his need for authenticity in all the wrong places. He hates her because she reveals him to himself. Yet her chaos also draws him in, forcing him to confront the contradictions he wants to ignore. She doesn't tidy herself up for anyone, doesn't play by the rules of decorum. Where he hides his despair in catalogs and corporate uniforms, she wears hers like armor, her recklessness both destructive and honest. For me, Marla has always been the most human character in this world. She doesn't symbolize grand rebellion or systems of control. She symbolizes the messy, flawed, vulnerable truth of being alive. Her addiction to chaos, her recklessness in love, her willingness to stare directly at pain without disguising it. All of these make her both unsettling and magnetic. And in the end, she is the one who remains when everything else collapses, the reminder that amidst ideology and destruction, what matters is connection. The faceless men who populate the basements, the fighters, the recruits of Project Mayhem, are not fully fleshed out individuals, and that is the point. They represent the longing for belonging, the willingness to surrender individuality for the comfort of a cause. They salute, they obey, they vanish into anonymity. They are disturbing not because they are villains, but because they are us. They remind me of how easy it is to trade freedom for certainty, how seductive it can be to dissolve into a group that promises meaning. Their lack of identity is itself their identity, and that emptiness lingers like an accusation. Even the bureaucrats, the bosses, the corporate faces who appear briefly, carry symbolic weight. They represent the machine the narrator is trying to escape. Authority without humanity, routine without meaning. They are not grand villains. They are placeholders for a system that dehumanizes by its very structure. Their power is not in cruelty, but in indifference, which can be far more chilling. When I reflect on these characters together, what strikes me is how they function less as individuals and more as fragments of a psyche, shards of a mirror reflecting the fractured state of modern identity. The narrator is repression and emptiness. His altar is desire and destruction. Marla is messy reality, unfiltered and uncontainable. The fighters are conformity, the loss of individuality in search of belonging. The bureaucrats are the system, faceless and indifferent. Put together, they form not just a cast, but a portrait, an allegory of a man, of a culture, of a generation wrestling with meaning in a world that sells everything except authenticity. And that, I think, is why the story lingers. These characters are not simply people we watch. They are parts of ourselves we would rather not face. The insomniac who drifts through life half awake. The alter ego who promises freedom but demands obedience. The woman whose chaos mirrors our own hidden despair. And that, I think, is why the story lingers. These characters are not simply people we watch. They are parts of ourselves we would rather not face. The insomniac who drifts through life half awake. The alter ego who promises freedom but demands obedience. The woman whose chaos mirrors our own hidden despair. The faceless crowd that obeys because belonging feels safer than solitude. The indifferent machine that consumes without caring. Together, they form a constellation of our own contradictions, forcing us to confront truths we'd rather ignore. Each time I return to this story, I see myself differently in them. Sometimes I feel the exhaustion of the narrator, sometimes the seductive pull of the altar, sometimes the raw honesty of Marla, sometimes even the facelessness of the crowd. And maybe that's the real brilliance of these characters. They don't just tell a story. They hold up a mirror, daring us to recognize ourselves in their fractures. Strangeness clings to this film like a second skin. It isn't just in the narrative, where reality bends and fractures, but in the way the film itself came into being, how it was received, and the odd details that continue to swirl around its legacy. Every time I dig into its production history or recall how people reacted to it, I feel as though I'm uncovering hidden chapters, like marginalia scribbled in the margins of a novel. The strangest facts don't sit on the surface. They slip into the cracks, echoing the film's themes of illusion, rebellion, and the refusal to be tidy. One of the strangest aspects of the film is how misunderstood it was at first. Today it's considered a cult classic, endlessly quoted and analyzed in classrooms. But when it was released, it baffled critics and worried studios. The violence was condemned as gratuitous, the philosophy dismissed as juvenile, the humor misread as nihilism. Some critics even described it as irresponsible, as if a piece of art could single-handedly corrupt audiences. I find that odd, not because the criticism was unfounded. The film is unsettling, provocative, even reckless, but because those very qualities were the point. It was never designed to comfort. And yet, the strangeness lies in how what was once derided as dangerous eventually became celebrated as profound. There's also the bizarre matter of its marketing. The studio had no idea how to sell it. Was it an action movie? A satire? A psychological thriller? Early trailers focused on the fights, stripping away the philosophy and leaving audiences with the impression of a brawler's fantasy. The irony is that the story itself critiques commodification, yet it was packaged like a commodity it never wanted to be. That disconnect helped sink it at the box office, a failure so stark that insiders whispered the film might end the careers of those who made it. And yet, in the age of DVD, it exploded. Strangely enough, it became one of the earliest examples of a film finding its true audience not in theaters, but at home, where viewers could pause, rewind, argue, and dissect. Its second life was born not in spectacle, but in study. Then there are the production stories, odd, funny, sometimes unsettling, that give the film a strange mythos. Edward Norton, who played the insomniac narrator, actually lost weight during filming, his thinness emphasizing the fragility of his character. Brad Pitt, in contrast, chipped his own tooth to make his alter ego look more rough, more anarchic. He insisted on leaving it that way until filming ended. Helena Bonham Carter, playing Marla, requested that her makeup be applied with her left hand, so it would look messy and imperfect, like something her character would do herself. These choices blur the line between acting and embodiment, as if each performer wanted to bleed a little truth into the fiction. Even stranger is the way director David Fincher slipped hidden frames into the film. If you watch closely, you'll catch brief flashes, single frames, of the alter ego appearing long before he's introduced. They flicker so quickly most audiences don't consciously register them, but they burrow into the subconscious. This trick isn't just technical mischief, it's thematic, a way of planting the character into our minds before the narrator realizes he exists. When I first learned this, I was fascinated by how the strangeness of form mirrors the strangeness of content. The film itself is playing with us, implanting memories like the narrator's fractured psyche. The soap used in the film is another odd detail. It wasn't just a prop. It became a symbol so tied to the story that real-life companies later try to capitalize on it, selling soap branded with the film's logo. The irony is almost unbearable. A story critiquing consumerism turned into a consumer product. And yet, isn't that exactly what the story predicted? That even rebellion, once commodified, becomes another item to purchase? I find this one of the strangest and most haunting facts, that the critique of commodification became commodified itself, swallowed whole by the very system it despised. There are also tales of discomfort on set. The fight scenes were deliberately staged to be messy and ugly. Fincher refused to glamorize them, instructing stunt coordinators to make them awkward, to let punches miss, to let bodies collapse ungracefully. Norton and Pitt both endured real bruises and hits, blurring performance with pain. In one infamous moment, Norton really punched Pitt in the ear, eliciting the startled laugh we see in the final cut. That rawness adds to the sense of strangeness. The violence feels less like spectacle and more like ritual, unpolished and unsettling. Then there's the curious afterlife of certain lines. The first rule is you do not talk about it has been adopted everywhere, from advertising campaigns to comedy sketches, stripped of its context and turned into playful cliché. In the story, the line is deadly serious, part of the transformation of rebellion into dogma. The strangeness is in the dissonance, a warning turned into a joke, a critique turned into slogan. It makes me think of how easily meaning can be hollowed out when repeated enough times. Another strange fact is how often the film has been misinterpreted. Some audiences embrace the alter ego as a hero, idolizing his philosophy of destruction without noticing the critique woven into it. The story itself warns that rebellion can curdle into tyranny, yet many fans took the character's words at face value, turning him into a poster boy for defiance. It's unsettling, and it reveals something uncomfortable, that satire and critique are always vulnerable to being mistaken for the thing they condemn. When I think about this, I realize the film's strangeness lies not only in what it depicts, but in how it interacts with us, the viewers. It reflects back what we bring to it, whether insight or delusion. Even the ending has strange layers. The collapsing buildings were created with cutting-edge digital effects for their time, but what unsettles me is how eerily prophetic they feel now. Released before the events of the early 2000s that reshaped America's relationship with violence and spectacle, those final images seem almost too real in hindsight. What was once fantasy began to look like premonition. That's the strangest fact of all, how art, without intending to, sometimes predicts the darkness that history will later deliver.
And then, of course, there's a cultural afterlife. The film has become an academic text, dissected in classrooms, analyzed through lenses of gender, capitalism, psychoanalysis. Yet at the same time, it's become a dorm room poster, a quote slapped onto T-shirts, a brand of rebellion that can be purchased online. That duality is as strange as anything in the story itself. The way a critique of consumerism became one of the most consumed pieces of pop culture in the last quarter century. When I think of all these oddities, the chipped tooth, the hidden frames, the misunderstood philosophy, the commodified soap, the prophetic imagery, I realize that the film's strangeness is not accidental. It is essential. It is a story about contradiction, about rebellion becoming dogma, about identity fracturing into pieces. And its production, reception, and legacy mirror those contradictions in uncanny ways. It's as if the film itself refuses to stay still, refuses to be neatly defined, just as its characters refuse to be neatly contained. And perhaps that's why it continues to haunt. The strangest facts are not trivia to me. They are echoes of the story's themes, reminders that even behind the camera, even beyond the screen, the same forces of illusion, commodification, and rebellion are at work. The line between art and life blurs, just as the line between narrator and alter dissolves. And in that blur, the strangeness becomes a point. Critical perspectives around this film have always felt like extensions of the movie itself, fractured, contradictory, endlessly debated. To talk about it critically is to mirror the narrator's own journey. Every interpretation splits into 2, then 3, then more, until you're not sure which voice is real. And maybe that's the point. The story invites analysis not because it hands us answers, but because it insists on questions. When it first appeared in theaters, many critics recoiled. The violence seemed indulgent, the philosophy adolescent, the tone reckless. Roger Ebert famously dismissed it as macho porn, while other reviewers fretted that it glamorized brutality. What's strange is how these criticisms, though sincere, miss the irony woven into the film. The fights were never meant to look glamorous. They were ugly, awkward, deliberately stripped of cinematic polish. The philosophy was contradictory by design, not to be embraced but to be interrogated. The strangeness lies in how often critique became proof of the film's effectiveness. If it unsettled, if it angered, wasn't that the point? Academics have since pulled the film into every possible lens of interpretation. From a Marxist perspective, it is a scathing critique of late capitalism, exposing how consumer culture reduces identity to commodities. The narrator's IKEA-filled apartment becomes emblematic of a life measured in purchases, a catalog masquerading as a soul. His alter ego's rebellion against this consumerism, burning possessions, declaring freedom from ownership, reads like a call to arms against the emptiness of capitalist life. And yet, the paradox is clear. That rebellion becomes its own brand, its own form of consumption. Critics who approach it this way often highlight the irony that audiences later turn the alter ego into a commodity, his quotes printed on posters, his face plastered across merchandise. The film critiques commodification, only to be commodified itself. Psychoanalytic readings focus on the fractured identity at the heart of the story. Freud would see the narrator's repression and the alter's eruption as a dramatization of the ID breaking free from the superego's chains. Jungians interpret the alter as a narrator's shadow, the dark self buried beneath social expectations, emerging with destructive force when denied acknowledgement. The twist, that they are one and the same, becomes less a surprise and an inevitability. What we repress returns, often monstrously. I've always found this lens compelling, because it echoes in daily life. Who hasn't felt the tug of suppressed desires, the quiet rage that surfaces in unexpected ways? The film exaggerates it into violence, but the psychological truth underneath is disarmingly familiar. Gender theorists, meanwhile, have dissected it as a meditation on masculinity in crisis. The basements filled with fighting men, stripped to their rawest selves, become spaces of ritual where modern masculinity reclaims itself through pain. Critics argue that this obsession with physicality, with violence, is a reaction to a society that emasculates through cubicles, catalogs, and routines. Yet the critique doesn't stop there. The story also exposes the fragility of this performance. The alter ego promises strength, but his strength is performative, dependent on destruction. The narrator's search for identity through violence ultimately reveals the emptiness of that pursuit. I find this reading powerful because it refuses to let the film settle into heroics. It demands we see the basement not as liberation, but as symptom, a cry for men who don't know how to define themselves without bruises. Feminist critics often center Marla in their analyses, pointing out how she disrupts the male-centric rituals at the core of the narrative. She is chaotic, uncontainable, unwilling to conform. Her presence exposes a hollowness of the narrator's constructed reality, forcing him to confront what he's hiding from himself. Yet she is also marginalized within the story, treated as nuisance or temptation rather than equal. This duality has sparked fierce debate. Is Marla a critique of the male gaze, or is she trapped by it? For me, she feels like the pulse of messy reality intruding into the narrator's fantasies, a reminder that life cannot be neatly categorized into rules or rituals. Cultural critics often frame the film as prophetic, a text that anticipated the disillusionment of the 21st century. Released at the end of the 1990s, it captured a generation uneasy with consumerism but unsure how to resist it. In the decades since, its imagery, skyscrapers collapsing, faceless men obeying dogma, rebellion turning into cult, feels eerily prescient. Critics argue that it predicted the hollow radicalism of online communities, the way a rebellion could be co-opted into extremism, the way dissatisfaction could be weaponized. Watching it now, I can't help but feel its warnings echo louder than ever, not as instruction, but as cautionary tale. Philosophers, too, have weighed in. Some see it as Nietzschean, a call to embrace chaos, to live beyond good and evil. Others see it as Sartrean, an existential demand to create meaning in a meaningless world. Still others see it as parody, a critique of those very philosophies, exposing the absurdity of living without limits. What fascinates me is how the film refuses to commit. It offers rebellion, then critiques it. It offers philosophy, then mocks it. Critics struggle because the film itself struggles, deliberately ambiguous, slippery by design.
The set design amplified these themes. The narrator's apartment was meticulously dressed with IKEA furniture, carefully cataloged like a showroom. Fincher even inserted a visual gag where product descriptions appear on screen, parodying how consumer culture overlays our lives. In contrast, the dilapidated house where the narrator and his alter live was constructed to look like it was rotting from within, walls damp and peeling, floors creaking, everything unstable. Moving from the sterile apartment to the decaying house felt like stepping from one ideology to another, order collapsing into chaos. The production wasn't without battles. Executives were nervous from the start, unsure how to market such a strange hybrid of satire, violence, and philosophy. They pushed Fincher to soften the tone, to make the ending more conventional, to ensure audiences wouldn't be alienated. Fincher resisted, holding his ground in ways that mirrored the film's themes of defiance against control. The studio eventually relented, but not without bruises. When the film underperformed at the box office, those executives pointed fingers, calling it a failure of vision. And yet, Fincher's stubbornness ensured that the film we got was uncompromised, messy in the exact way it needed to be. Another oddity lies in the score. The Dust Brothers crafted a soundtrack that felt unlike anything else at the time. Electronic, abrasive, pulsing with energy that matched the film's anarchic rhythm. It didn't sound like a typical Hollywood thriller. It sounded like rebellion put to music, like chaos with a beat. That choice was risky, but it amplified the strangeness, the sense that we weren't watching a movie so much as being pulled into an experience. And then there was the aftermath. Though the film struggled financially in theaters, it became a sensation in the home video market. DVDs flew off shelves, and suddenly it was everywhere, quoted in dorm rooms, debated in classrooms, dissected in essays. The very audience the studio didn't know how to reach found it on their own, outside the structures of marketing. That, to me, is the strangest and most fitting fact. A film about resisting commodification found its true life through word of mouth, through underground circulation, almost like its own secret club. Reading about the production, I'm always struck by how much the film mirrors its own making. The battles between director and studio echo the battles between individuality and conformity. The actors' willingness to bruise themselves for authenticity mirrors the characters' search for reality through pain. The subliminal flashes mirror the story's fractures of perception. Even its failure at the box office mirrors the narrator's collapse, only for it to find a second life as something more powerful than success, a text that refuses to die. For me, the production isn't just backstory, it's part of the story. It tells us that art worth making often emerges from risk, from conflict, from the refusal to play safe. It tells us that sometimes failure is the disguise of legacy, that what doesn't work in the market can thrive in memory. And it tells us that strangeness, on set, in editing, in marketing, isn't weakness but strength, the thing that ensures a film will be argued about, remembered, rewatched. That's why I love tracing the fun facts and insights of this film's creation. They aren't trivia. They're extensions of the text, proof that the themes on screen were alive in the very process of making it. Chaos, control, rebellion, commodification. The film lived them before it depicted them. And in that, it became not just a piece of cinema, but a mirror, reflecting not only us, but the very industry that tried to contain it. The world this story builds is not just a backdrop. It is an extension of the characters' inner lives, a mirror of their fractures and contradictions. Every space, every shadow, every texture feels intentional, as though the cinematography itself were whispering commentary. When I think about the settings, I don't just recall places. I recall states of mind. Loneliness, chaos, disintegration, etched into physical form. The environments are psychological landscapes, as much as physical ones, and they shape how we interpret everything that unfolds. The apartment where the narrator begins his journey is sterile perfection, a catalog come to life. IKEA furniture lined up in neat precision, everything labeled, categorized, chosen not for meaning but for appearance. Fincher films it almost like a commercial, inserting product descriptions on screen as though life itself has become one long advertisement. For me, this apartment has always represented the illusion of control, the way we cling to objects to prove to ourselves that we exist. The walls are unblemished, the lighting clean, but the emptiness is suffocating. It's a prison disguised as comfort. When that apartment is destroyed in flames, the loss is shocking not because of the objects themselves, but because of what they symbolize, the collapse of a self built on consumption. The house that replaces it is the apartment's opposite. Dilapidated, leaky, rotting from the inside out, it is chaos embodied. The floors creak, the walls peel, the electricity flickers unreliably. The place looks ready to collapse at any moment. Yet within its instability lies freedom. The narrator moves from the sterile prison of his apartment into a house where nothing is fixed, nothing is certain. It becomes the physical manifestation of his psyche unraveling. I've always thought of that house as a character in itself. The crumbling subconscious, the buried self breaking through the neat facade. Living there is uncomfortable, but it forces confrontation with disorder. The basements where the first fights erupt are perhaps the most iconic setting. Dimly lit, damp, crowded with sweat and bodies, they feel like ancient ritual spaces. The fights are staged not as cinematic spectacles, but as raw, awkward collisions, and the setting reinforces that rawness. In those basements, social hierarchies dissolve. Men shed their office clothes, their roles, their illusions, and meet as equals in pain. These spaces are both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because they strip away pretense, terrifying because they reduce life to violence. The basements feel like temples, but temples to what? That ambiguity makes them linger. The office, by contrast, is filmed with fluorescent sterility. Cubicles stretch endlessly, bosses drone, everything feels suffocating. The camera lingers on the monotony, amplifying the sense that this environment is designed to suppress individuality. The contrast between the basement and the office is deliberate. One space brims with raw, messy energy, the other with sterile routine. Watching those sequences, I'm reminded of how environments shape behavior, how a room can either drain us or ignite us. Urban spaces carry their own symbolism. The city at night, with its glowing signs and endless streets, feels like an organism of consumerism, pulsing with advertisements. Fincher's use of bleach bypass cinematography makes the city look grimy, as though even neon lights are diseased. The streets where Project Mayhem enacts its vandalism are filmed with handheld urgency, reflecting both spontaneity and menace. These urban settings are not neutral. They're saturated with critique, showing us the machinery of consumer society in all its artificial glow. Even the ending is subject to debate. The narrator kills the part of himself that created chaos, choosing Marla's hand as skyscrapers collapse. Is this triumph? Defeat? Delusion? Some critics read it as redemption. He has faced his shadow and chosen connection over destruction. Others see it as failure. He has silenced one voice, but not solved the fracture within. For me, the power of the ending lies in its refusal to answer. Two people hold hands as the world crumbles, and that is both terrifying and tender, collapse and intimacy all at once. Cinematically, critics have marveled at Fincher's style, the bleach bypass cinematography, the grimy textures, the digital tricks slipping subliminal frames into the film. Some argue that the style seduces audiences into embracing the very ideology it critiques, while others argue it sharpens the satire. I find a strangeness in how critics themselves often mirror the narrator's confusion, seduced and repulsed at once, unable to fully separate critique from complicity. What I find most haunting is how critical perspectives mirror the story's themes of projection and misunderstanding. Just as the narrator projects his desires onto his altar, audiences have projected their own ideologies onto the film. Some idolize the altar as hero, missing the critique. Some dismiss the narrator as pathetic, missing the universality of his despair. Some reduce Marla to accessory, ignoring her role as mirror. The film resists single interpretation because it was never meant to be contained. It is a text designed to fracture, to force us into debate, to make us question not just what we watched, but how we watched it. And perhaps that is the ultimate critical perspective, that the film itself is a test, a mirror held up to its audience. If you walk away idolizing its rebellion, maybe you've missed its warning. If you walk away condemning its violence, maybe you've ignored its satire. If you walk away unsettled, unsure, haunted by contradictions, that's when it's done its work. The strangest truth about this story is that it doesn't tell us what to think. It tells us to think, to wrestle, to confront our own shadows. And in that sense, every critical debate, every contradiction, every disagreement is not failure. It's fulfillment. The production of this film feels almost as wild and unpredictable as the story it tells. Behind the scenes, it unfolded as a battle of wills, a gamble with no guarantee of survival, and an experiment in pushing boundaries that studios didn't quite understand. Every time I revisit the history of how it was made, I'm struck by how closely the process mirrors the themes of the film itself: chaos, control, rebellion, and the uneasy marriage between authenticity and artifice. David Fincher, still relatively young as a director, but already known for his meticulous style, took the reins with a clarity of vision that unnerved executives. He didn't want to make a conventional thriller. He wanted something dangerous, unsettling, messy in its energy yet precise in its execution. On set, he was infamous for his perfectionism, shooting dozens of takes until he found the exact rhythm of a line or the exact flicker of emotion in an actor's eyes. Some described his process as exhausting, others as transformative. What fascinated me, reading about those shoots, is how Fincher embodied the very paradox of the narrator and his alter, obsessively controlling in service of portraying chaos. Casting was a story in itself. Edward Norton was chosen as the narrator, bringing with him a cerebral intensity that perfectly captured the fragility of a man dissolving under insomnia. Norton wasn't the obvious choice. The role had been courted by other big names, but his ability to balance repression with vulnerability made him the perfect vessel for the film's ambiguity. He didn't just act the role. He seemed to inhabit it, losing weight to appear drawn and weary, leaning into the detachment that defined the character. In interviews, he admitted that playing the part sometimes unsettled him personally, as though the lines between his own voice and the narrator's internal monologue blurred. Brad Pitt, by contrast, relished the chance to embody chaos. Already a star, he chipped a tooth to make his alter ego look more raw, less polished, and he dove headfirst into the role's anarchic energy. His physicality, his laughter, even the way he moved seemed like rebellion given flesh. The chemistry between Norton and Pitt carried the film. Their dynamic was less scripted than sparked, each performance feeding the other. I think often about how perfectly their energies matched. Norton's quiet implosion against Pitt's explosive charisma. Without that balance, the film could have collapsed into parody. With it, it became a study in duality. Helena Bonham Carter brought another texture entirely. Her portrayal of Marla was messy, chaotic, and heartbreakingly real. She insisted her makeup be applied with her left hand so it would look haphazard, like something Marla herself would have done. She leaned into imperfection, refusing glamour, grounding the film in the raw honesty of a character who couldn't be commodified. On set, she reportedly clashed at times with Fincher over interpretation, but those tensions seemed to feed the role, giving her performance the edge it needed. For me, Carter's Marla has always felt like the anchor of reality, the one character who doesn't collapse into ideology, who remains stubbornly, beautifully human. Filming itself carried its share of strange stories. The fight scenes, central to the film, were deliberately choreographed to look unchoreographed. Fincher didn't want slick action. He wanted awkward, painful, exhausting collisions. Norton and Pitt took real hits at times, bruising their bodies to make the fights believable. In one now famous moment, Norton really punched Pitt in the ear, catching him off guard. Pitt's startled reaction, half laughter and half pain, was kept in the final cut. That authenticity mattered. Watching those fights, you don't feel like you're seeing movie violence. You feel like you're intruding on something ritualistic, something intimate and raw. Fincher also experimented with subliminal imagery. Before the alter ego is formally introduced, he appears in single-frame flashes spliced into scenes, flickering at the edge of perception. Most viewers didn't consciously notice these flashes, but their subconscious did, planting the character into the mind before the narrator acknowledged him. It's a sly, brilliant trick, one that mirrors the story's themes of implanted ideas and fractured perception. Even in editing, the film plays games with us, making us complicit in its illusions. The climactic buildings, looming skyscrapers filled with financial records, stand as monuments to control and commodification. Their eventual collapse is staged as both spectacle and metaphor, the destruction of systems that measure life in debt and balance sheets. What unsettles me is how clean the destruction looks, how symmetrical, almost beautiful. It's a reminder that chaos can be seductive, that even annihilation can be framed as art. Fincher plays with that ambiguity, forcing us to ask whether we are horrified or enthralled. Lighting carries as much meaning as setting. The apartment glows with clean whites, the house with sickly yellows, the basements with deep shadows. Each environment has its palette, its atmosphere. Silence dominates the mountains of solitude early on, while noise overwhelms the crowded gatherings later. I find this use of cinematic texture brilliant because it externalizes inner states. Loneliness looks like sterile light, chaos looks like rot, repression looks like fluorescence. Even sound plays into this. In the office, the hum of computers and the drone of voices feel anesthetizing. In the basements, the sound of fists and grunts becomes ritual. In the house, dripping pipes and creaking floors remind us of instability. And in the climax, the sound of collapsing towers is almost serene, underscored by music that transforms destruction into haunting poetry. These soundscapes are not incidental. They are part of the storytelling, shaping our emotional response. Symbolically, the settings embody the journey of the narrator. He moves from sterile control, apartment, to chaotic dissolution, house, to ritualized violence, basements, to catastrophic resolution, skyscrapers collapsing. Each environment reflects a stage of his psyche, a stage of rebellion and collapse. Marla's world, cluttered, messy, filled with cigarette smoke and secondhand dresses, acts as counterpoint, reminding us of the messy humanity that resists categorization. For me, the genius of the film's settings lies in how they transform abstract ideas into tangible spaces. Consumerism becomes the apartment. Chaos becomes the house. Rebellion becomes the basement. Collapse becomes the skyline. The environments do not just contain the story. They are the story. And that's why the film lingers. When I think of it, I don't only remember the characters. I remember the sterile, catalog-perfect apartment, the rotting house that seemed alive in its decay, the basement where fists became prayers, the skyline dissolving into dust. These places live in memory because they're not just settings. They're allegories shaping how we see the characters and perhaps how we see ourselves. Behind the scenes, the making of this film unfolded almost like the narrative it depicts. Fractured, confrontational, rebellious, and always teetering between disaster and brilliance. It's easy to forget now, when the film is revered as a cult classic, that it was a deeply contested project, one that terrified executives, exhausted its cast, and divided critics. But that's exactly why its production story fascinates me. It mirrors the themes of control, chaos, and identity collapse that pulse through every frame. David Fincher stepped into the director's chair with something to prove. His earlier experience with Alien 3 had left him bruised by studio interference, and he vowed never again to surrender his vision. This determination shaped the production. Fincher fought battles on every front, often clashing with executives at Fox who feared the film's violence, tone, and anti-consumer satire. He described the story not as a thriller, but as a romantic comedy, an answer so strange and defiant that it both unsettled and intrigued his collaborators. What he meant, of course, was that beneath the chaos and blood, this was a love story between fractured selves, with Marla as the anchor to reality. Casting was another battlefield. The studio initially wanted more conventional choices, stars with mainstream appeal who could soften the risk. Brad Pitt was eventually secured, bringing his charisma and willingness to dismantle his own heartthrob image. He chipped his tooth, trained extensively, and leaned into the role's anarchic edge. Edward Norton was chosen after other candidates passed, and his cerebral intensity balanced Pitt's chaos. Their chemistry became the film's heartbeat. Norton, meticulous and restrained, played repression to perfection. Pitt, reckless and magnetic, embodied the unleashed shadow. Their dynamic was so alive that Fincher often let the cameras roll long past scripted beats, capturing spontaneous reactions. Helena Bonham Carter's casting as Marla was equally daring. Fincher wanted someone who could embody both fragility and danger, someone whose presence would disrupt every scene. Carter threw herself into the role, requesting her makeup be applied sloppily with her left hand so it would look like something Marla might have done herself. Her performance unnerved both Norton and Pitt, grounding their manic energy with her own unpredictable honesty. The fight scenes became infamous during production. Fincher rejected polished choreography, demanding instead that fights look awkward, exhausting, painful. Norton and Pitt agreed to take real hits in several scenes, adding to the rawness. In one iconic moment, Norton punched Pitt in the ear for real, eliciting the surprised laugh that remains in the final cut. The extras in those basement sequences were drawn into the energy, some of them flinching or cheering spontaneously, blurring the line between stage violence and something closer to ritual. Fincher's experiments with subliminal imagery extended into production tricks. Before the alter ego is formally introduced, single frames of him were spliced into earlier scenes, flickering so quickly that most viewers didn't consciously register them. Fincher delighted in these illusions, calling them visual whispers. He even inserted a joke at the end, when a frame of explicit material flashes just before the credits, echoing the alter's prankster philosophy. These choices weren't gimmicks. They were part of Fincher's mission to make the audience complicit, to fracture perception as much as the narrator's mind. The set design was meticulous. The narrator's apartment was filled with actual IKEA furniture, cataloged like a showroom. Cinematographers inserted product labels on screen, parodying consumer culture. The decaying house on Paper Street was built on a soundstage, but designed to look like it was collapsing in on itself. Its floors sagged, its walls dripped with water, its electrical system sputtered unreliably. Crew members described it as the most depressing set they had ever worked on, yet became the perfect metaphorical space, chaos embodied. On set, Fincher's perfectionism tested everyone. He was known for shooting dozens of takes, sometimes over 100, to capture the exact rhythm he wanted. Actors described the process as exhausting, but ultimately transformative. Norton later admitted that Fincher's relentless approach forced him to shed habits and find rawer, more vulnerable performances. Pitt, equally drained, confessed that Fincher's vision pushed him further than he thought possible. Carter, in her wry way, described Fincher as both tyrant and genius. Executives at Fox grew increasingly nervous as the production costs climbed and early test screenings revealed polarized reactions. They pushed for changes to the ending, fearing that audiences wouldn't tolerate the destruction of skyscrapers or the ambiguity of holding hands in the face of collapse. Fincher resisted fiercely, and in the end, his version prevailed. Ironically, years later, that ending became one of the most iconic in cinema history, precisely because of its audacity. One of the strangest behind-the-scenes stories involves the marketing. The studio had no idea how to sell the film. They cut trailers emphasizing the fights, portraying it as a macho action flick, stripping away the satire and philosophy. This misrepresentation contributed to its poor box office performance, as audiences expecting a brawler's fantasy were confronted with something far more unsettling and cerebral. Fincher later remarked that the marketing campaign betrayed the film's spirit, commodifying what was meant to critique commodification. The irony was bitter but fitting. Despite the friction, the camaraderie on set was real. Norton and Pitt became close, sharing jokes between takes, improvising lines, even sketching out ideas with Fincher late into the night. The rawness of their bond seeped into the film, giving their dynamic its crackling authenticity. Carter, though often separate in her scenes, described feeling like the outsider in real life too, mirroring Marla's role. That layering of reality and fiction gave the production an almost uncanny quality, as though the lines were always blurred. When the film premiered, it sparked outrage, confusion, and admiration in equal measure. Some walked out appalled. Others hailed it as groundbreaking. Studio executives considered it a disaster, but Fincher's uncompromising approach ensured that it was exactly the film he intended to make. In time, that integrity proved its worth. On DVD, it became a sensation, selling millions of copies, spreading like wildfire through college campuses and late-night screenings. For me, the behind-the-scenes story is as essential as the film itself. It shows us that art worth making often comes from struggle, from defiance, from risking failure. The actors bruised themselves, the director fought his own studio, the production stumbled through chaos, and what emerged was a work of cinema that feels alive, unstable, impossible to pin down. It's fitting that a film about rebellion, commodification, and fractured identity was itself born from battles with control, misunderstanding, and compromise. And perhaps that's the greatest behind-the-scenes insight. The film didn't just depict chaos, it lived it. In its making, in its release, in its afterlife, it carried the very contradictions it sought to expose. It was misunderstood, commodified, idolized, condemned, and ultimately resurrected as legend. Just like the narrator himself, it survived not by being neat or safe, but by enduring its fractures. Themes run through this story like veins beneath the skin, pulsing with contradictions, paradoxes, and uneasy truths. To watch it closely is to recognize that what appears to be a tale of violence and rebellion is, at its core, a meditation on identity, alienation, and the perilous search for authenticity in a world that sells us versions of ourselves by the page and product. Every rewatch feels like peeling back another layer, discovering that the symbols I thought I understood shift and mutate, refusing to be locked into a single meaning. The first and most obvious theme is consumerism, the way modern life reduces identity to purchases. The narrator's early obsession with IKEA furniture is the clearest example. His apartment filled with catalog-perfect objects meant to make him feel complete. But these objects don't give him meaning, they smother him. His fire, which reduces everything to ashes, is both literal and symbolic, a cleansing of the false self built on commodities. The critique here isn't subtle, but it's sharp. We are sold the illusion that buying the right sofa or lamp will make us whole. The story exposes that illusion for what it is, a cage disguised as comfort. From there, the theme of identity fractures wide open. The narrator doesn't just lack purpose, he lacks a self. His insomnia is the physical symptom of this emptiness, a metaphor for drifting through life half awake. He needs others suffering to feel alive, attending support groups to borrow authenticity. And then, of course, his alter ego emerges, a projection of everything he represses, the charismatic shadow that embodies desire, rebellion, and destruction. The twist that they're the same person is more than a clever plot device. It is the thematic heart. It tells us that rebellion and conformity are not opposites, but intertwined, that the voices we follow often come from within our own fractures. Masculinity, too, runs as a central theme. The basements filled with men punching each other are not simply about violence. They're about longing for identity. These men, stripped of roles, suits, and routines, gather to feel something primal. Their rituals reflect a crisis of modern masculinity, where strength and identity are no longer tied to survival, but to consumption. The story suggests that in the absence of authentic roles, men revert to ritualized violence, mistaking pain for meaning. It is both critique and exploration, asking whether this violence is rebellion or symptom. Violence itself becomes symbolic. The fights are ugly, awkward, exhausting. They are not about victory, but about sensation, about shaking loose the numbness of modern existence. In this way, violence is less an end than a means, a ritual of self-discovery through destruction. It's disturbing, yes, but it also resonates with the hunger for intensity we all sometimes feel. The story critiques this hunger even as it dramatizes it, forcing us to wrestle with the paradox of seeking meaning in pain. Another theme that fascinates me is the tension between freedom and control. The alter ego preaches freedom, freedom from possessions, from systems, from the illusions of modern life. But the freedom he offers is quickly revealed to be another form of control. Project Mayhem, with its rules, rituals, and hierarchy, mirrors the very structures it claims to dismantle. This irony is deliberate. Rebellion becomes dogma. Freedom becomes tyranny. Individuality dissolves into conformity. For me, this is one of the most haunting insights of the story, that even our attempts to escape systems often recreate them in new forms. Marla's presence adds another layer. She is messy, chaotic, uncontained. She represents reality, flawed, vulnerable, authentic in her imperfection. The narrator resents her because she disrupts his illusions, yet she is also his lifeline, the reminder that connection matters more than ideology. Symbolically, she is the antidote to both consumerism and rebellion. Where the narrator builds his self through objects and the alter builds his through destruction, Marla simply exists, unapologetically herself. She represents the possibility of authenticity not through violence or possession, but through being seen. The settings themselves embody symbolism. The apartment is sterility, the house is chaos, the basement is ritual, the skyscrapers are control. Their destruction at the end symbolizes collapse, not just of buildings, but of illusions. The final image, two people holding hands as the world crumbles, captures the thematic heart. Then the face of systems collapsing, connection is the only truth that remains. Even subliminal imagery plays into the symbolism. The fleeting flashes of the altar before his introduction remind us that he was always there, lurking in the subconscious. The splice frame at the end is both prank and symbol, a reminder that rebellion leaves its mark even in collapse. These tricks reinforce the theme of fractured perception, of how reality is never stable but always constructed, contested, and manipulated. For me, the most profound theme is the search for authenticity. The narrator longs to feel real, to escape the numbness of modern life. He finds it in violence, in rebellion, in destruction, but ultimately, these are illusions too. Authenticity does not come from possessions or from anarchic manifestos. It comes from facing the self, from accepting contradictions, from choosing connection over ideology. This is why the final act matters so much. The narrator silences his shadow, not with victory, but with surrender, choosing Marla's hand over chaos. Symbolism saturates every frame. Soap, for example, is more than soap. It is transformation, destruction repurposed into cleansing. Blood is more than blood. It is proof of existence, of sensation. The collapsing skyscrapers are not just spectacle. They're metaphors for systems of power reduced to rubble. Each symbol refuses to be simple, layered with contradictions that echo the themes themselves. What makes these themes resonate is how personal they feel. Who hasn't felt the emptiness of consumption, the hunger for something real, the confusion between freedom and control? Who hasn't wrestled with shadows of the self, with contradictions that defy resolution? The story forces us to confront these questions without comfort. It does not tell us what authenticity looks like. It simply exposes the false paths we cling to. And that is why the film endures. Its themes are not tidy lessons, but provocations. Consumerism, identity, masculinity, rebellion, authenticity, each is explored not to resolve but to unsettle. The symbolism, from soap to skyscrapers, forces us to see beyond the surface. And the final image reminds us that amidst collapse, the only thing that matters is connection. Two hands clasped as the world crumbles. That is the story's answer, and its refusal to answer, all at once. The way this film was crafted is almost as compelling as the story it tells. Its filmmaking techniques are bold, abrasive, and often sly, designed not to lull the audience, but to provoke, unsettle, and implicate them. Whenever I think about its construction, I'm struck by how the very tools of cinema, lighting, editing, sound, design, become extensions of its themes. The film doesn't just tell a story about fractured identity and rebellion against consumerism. It embodies that rebellion in how it is made. And then, of course, there's the paradox of its box office fate. Condemned at first, resurrected later, commodified in the very ways it sought to critique. Cinematography is the foundation. Fincher worked with Jeff Cronenweth to create a look that was both grimy and precise. They used a bleach bypass process to desaturate colors, giving the film a sickly palette of greens, grays, and yellows. The effect is unsettling. Sterile apartments look too clean, basements look damp and diseased, cityscapes glow with artificial light that feels toxic. This isn't just style, it's substance. The visual tone embodies the rot beneath consumerist sheen. Watching it, you feel the world decaying even when nothing is happening. Lighting plays into this decay. Fluorescent bulbs hum coldly in offices, drowning everything in sterile monotony. The narrator's apartment is brightly lit, yet lifeless. In contrast, the house on Paper Street is dim, shadowy, leaking light in fragments through broken windows. Basements are shrouded in darkness, with single bulbs dangling like ritual torches. Fincher used these contrasts deliberately. Light doesn't symbolize clarity here. It often symbolizes oppression, while shadow becomes the space where hidden truths emerge. That inversion unsettled me deeply the first time I noticed it, because it turns our expectations upside down. Editing carries its own subversive tricks. Fincher slips single frames of the altar into early scenes, almost subliminally. They flicker for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register in the subconscious. It's a mischievous technique that mirrors the narrator's fractured perception. Later, spliced images, a pornographic frame inserted at the end, echo the altar's pranks. These editing choices aren't gimmicks. They make the audience complicit, implanting ideas without consent. The form mirrors the content. We, too, are manipulated, our perception fractured just like the narrator's. Sound design adds another layer of disquiet. Offices hum with monotony. Keyboards clacking, printers spitting, voices droning. Basements reverberate with the thud of fists, the slap of bodies, the grunts of exertion. The house creaks, drips, and groans, alive in its decay. These soundscapes make the world feel tactile, oppressive, unignorable. Over this, the Dust Brothers' score pulses with electronic beats and abrasive rhythms. The music feels less like accompaniment and more like intrusion, syncopated, jarring, daring you to resist comfort. It's rebellion in sound, refusing sentimentality, refusing to let the audience sink into cinematic ease. The fight scenes themselves are technical feats. Fincher rejected polished choreography, instead staging them to look awkward and brutal. He used multiple cameras to capture rawness from every angle, then cut them together not for elegance, but for impact. The fights feel real precisely because they are messy. Missed punches, exhausted gasps, blood flowing ungracefully. In one infamous take, Norton hit Pitt for real, capturing the surprised laugh that remains in the film. This commitment to authenticity blurred the line between acting and reality, echoing the story's own obsession with what is real and what is performance. Even the sets embody technique as theme. The narrator's apartment was dressed with genuine IKEA furniture, cataloged meticulously. The Paper Street house was built to look like it was collapsing, with warped floors and dripping ceilings. Fincher insisted that every environment feel alive, not in beauty, but in decay. The camera doesn't just observe these spaces, it dwells in them, forcing us to breathe their air. For me, this insistence on atmosphere makes the film literary in texture. Spaces become metaphors, environments become characters. Box office performance, however, was its own narrative arc. With a budget hovering around $65 million, the studio expected a hit. Instead, the film stumbled badly. Audiences, misled by trailers emphasizing macho fights, were confused and unsettled by its irony and satire. Critics were divided, with some praising its audacity and others condemning it as nihilistic. Domestically, it earned around $37 million, an embarrassment compared to expectations. For a moment, it seemed like the film would vanish as a misfire, remembered only as a cautionary tale. But then came the second life. On DVD, it became a phenomenon. It sold millions of copies, fueled by word of mouth, college dorm debates, and repeat viewings. People dissected its philosophy, memorized its lines, projected its rebellion onto their own frustrations. What flopped in theaters thrived in private spaces. This shift is poetic. A story about underground rebellion found its audience underground, outside the mainstream. The very failure at the box office allowed it to be resurrected as legend. The irony, though, is unavoidable. A film that critiques consumerism became a consumer product par excellence. Its quotes were plastered on posters, its imagery commodified, its alter ego idolized as a hero by those who missed the critique. Soap branded with the film's logo was sold in stores. Rebellion became merchandise. Critique became slogan. This commodification is strange, but fitting. It proves the story's point. Even rebellion can be packaged and sold. From a filmmaking perspective, what fascinates me most is how the techniques embody the themes. Desaturated colors reflect decay. Subliminal cuts reflect fractured perception. Sound design reflects alienation. Awkward fights reflect messy authenticity. Even its box office arc reflects its philosophy. Misunderstood, rejected, then resurrected through word of mouth, commodified in the very system it tried to resist. The film lives its contradictions not only in story, but in form, production, and reception. And that, to me, is why it endures. It isn't just about rebellion. It rebels in how it is made. It isn't just about fractured identity. It fractures the audience's perception. It isn't just about consumerism. It becomes consumer product and critique all at once. Its filmmaking techniques and its box office fate weave together into a story that mirrors the very themes it explores. In that sense, it is more than a movie. It is a paradox alive in its contradictions, daring us to wrestle with them. Every story has to end, but this one doesn't so much close as it fractures into lingering echoes. Even now, decades after its release, I can't watch it without feeling unsettled in some new way. The conclusion isn't tidy because it was never meant to be. This is not the kind of film that ties up its questions in a neat bows. It leaves them hanging in the air, heavy and insistent, demanding that we wrestle with them long after the screen goes black. The narrator's journey, if we can even call it that, isn't a triumph in the usual sense. He doesn't conquer an external villain, doesn't emerge as a polished hero. What he does is face himself, or at least the fractured parts of himself that he can no longer ignore. What he realizes that his charismatic companion, his imagined liberator, is nothing but his own shadow. The entire narrative folds in on itself. That collapse is the point. He's forced to confront what so many of us avoid, that the enemies we fight are often echoes of our own desires, our own repression, our own contradictions. The final act, with its skyscrapers crumbling in perfect symmetry, is less about destruction than about exposure. The buildings fall, financial systems collapse, but the true revolution isn't outside, it's within. By turning the gun on himself, silencing the part of him that demanded chaos, he does something paradoxical. He reclaims his agency by surrendering. He doesn't win the war by outmuscling his shadow, but by acknowledging it, killing it, and choosing connection over annihilation. The act is both violent and tender, both grotesque and redemptive. That duality is what makes it unforgettable. What stays with me most, though, is not the spectacle of falling towers, but the small gesture in the final frame. Two people holding hands as the world collapses. After everything, The violence, the rebellion, the ideology, the destruction. What remains is intimacy, a fragile, human connection that matters more than philosophy or revolution. I think about that often, how in our own lives, amidst systems collapsing and ideologies clashing, what we reach for isn't chaos, but each other. That image, two hands clasped in the dark, feels like the true ending, the one that makes all the chaos meaningful. The themes echo long after. Consumerism, identity, masculinity, rebellion, authenticity. They don't resolve. They reverberate. The narrator never finds a perfect answer, and neither do we. Instead, we're left with provocations. Are we defined by what we own? Can we ever escape systems of control? Or do we simply recreate them in new forms? Is rebellion authentic, or is it always vulnerable to commodification? These aren't questions with neat answers, but questions that haunt. And maybe that's why the story matters so much. Not because it comforts us, but because it refuses to. Behind the camera, the production mirrored the narrative's turbulence. Fincher fought his studio, the actors bruised themselves in pursuit of rawness, and the film flopped at first before finding its audience underground. Its afterlife is poetic, misunderstood in the marketplace, resurrected in private spaces, commodified in the very system it critiqued. That contradiction is the story's legacy. It didn't just depict rebellion against consumerism. It lived it, and then it was consumed anyway. That irony is not failure. It's proof of its relevance. For me, personally, this film has always been like a troublesome friend. I don't always agree with it. Sometimes I even resent it, but I can't stop thinking about it. It forces me to confront my own shadows, my own complicity in the systems I critique, my own hunger for authenticity in a world that sells everything except the real. It's not a film I watch to be entertained. It's a film I watch to be unsettled, to be provoked, to be reminded that art is supposed to complicate rather than soothe. And so the conclusion is this. The film is not an answer, but a mirror. It reflects back the fractures in our culture and in ourselves. It critiques consumerism while becoming a commodity, exposes toxic masculinity while seducing audiences with it, dismantles rebellion while inspiring it. Its contradictions are not weaknesses. They are its essence. To engage with it is to engage with paradox, to admit that meaning is messy, fractured, unresolved.